a black doctor, fresh off a 14-hour shift, finally heads home eager to see his family. But the moment he steps into the airport lounge, everything shifts. A gate agent questions his first-class ticket, eyes narrowing, and moments later, security is called. In front of the entire crowd, he's asked to step aside. What happens next not only silences the entire terminal but sparks a conversation no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is one story you'll want to hear. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if this resonates, don't forget to hit subscribe. It all started like any other travel day. The morning light slipped through the curtains with the kind of grace that belonged to Sundays. Though it was not a Sunday at all, Gabriel Reed sat at his kitchen table, the newspaper spread before him like a map to familiar disappointments. His coffee cooled beside him, untouched. It wasn't the headlines that held his gaze, but the simple fact of the table's quiet, how the stillness could feel heavier than noise. He was a man accustomed to silence. But not this particular kind. This silence carried the weight of words unsaid, of rooms where his presence was tolerated but not welcomed. He adjusted his cufflinks out of habit. There was a meeting at noon. The kind of meeting that required ties, firm handshakes, and the careful choreography of corporate decorum. Gabriel had danced this dance for decades, but he knew the floor was uneven beneath his feet. At 58, he had learned to navigate these spaces with precision. His posture, his tone, even the measured nods he gave to the security guard at the entrance, all of it rehearsed. Necessary. But no amount of rehearsal could stop the familiar pause that came when he stepped into the boardroom. Mr. Reed, I believe we'll need your expertise on this. Someone would say, their eyes flickering to him as if unsure of why he was there at all. And Gabriel would offer the same calm, the same steady voice that had carried him through decades of proving himself. The proving never ended. The office building was a monolith of glass and steel, reflecting the sun like a polished blade. Gabriel stepped through the lobby, his shoes striking the marble floor in steady rhythm. Behind the front desk, the receptionist, young, blonde, and visibly new, greeted him with a thin, polite smile. I'm here for the executive meeting, he said, offering his name. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation flickering across her face. Of course, sir. Could I see some ID? Gabriel exhaled, not visibly, but in the quiet spaces of his mind. He had been in and out of this building for nearly 10 years. His face, he suspected, was as familiar to the marble as the columns that held up the lobby. Yet here he was, pulling out his wallet with the patience of a man who had done this too many times to count. She checked his ID as if deciphering a foreign language, before finally nodding and gesturing to the elevators. It's just protocol, she said, smiling the way people smile when they know the lie they're telling is thin. Gabriel stepped inside the elevator, watching the doors seal shut. He thought about how many times he had been here before, how many times the weight of his presence needed explanation. The boardroom was already half full when Gabriel arrived. Men in dark suits clustered near the windows, laughing in the casual way that signaled familiarity, the language of belonging. Gabriel took his seat near the far end of the table, carefully arranging his notes. No one questioned his seat, but he felt the subtle shift in energy when he spoke. When he pointed out errors in their financial projections, the room grew quiet. They nodded, they agreed, but beneath it was something unspoken, as if his clarity disrupted the carefully laid stones of their assumptions. After the meeting, one of the younger executives, Robert, bright-eyed and eager, caught up to him in the hallway. Mr. Reed, Robert began, I wanted to say I really appreciate your insight. You've been with the company a long time, haven't you? Gabriel smiled faintly. Long enough. I bet things were different when you started. Gabriel studied the young man's face, wondering if he truly understood the weight of what he had just said. They were, Gabriel replied, but some things don't change as quickly as others. Robert laughed, not fully grasping the depth of the response, and walked away, his steps light, unburdened. Gabriel lingered in the hallway for a moment longer, his reflection caught in the window across from him. The day was ordinary in every way. And yet, the weight of the ordinary was sometimes the heaviest thing of all. Gabriel Reed left the office building as the late afternoon sun dipped below the skyline, painting the glass towers in hues of amber and shadow. The day's small indignities clung to him, as they often did, like dust that refused to shake free. The walk to his car felt longer than usual, though the distance hadn't changed. As he passed through the parking garage, he saw his reflection in the windshield of his black sedan. A sharply dressed man, carrying himself with quiet authority. But in the undercurrent of his gaze, something lingered. Weariness. He unlocked the car and sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, as if the weight of motion was suddenly too much. The silence pressed in. A few years ago, when the company named him to the board, they called it progress. A step forward. They spoke of diversity with the kind of enthusiasm that came from those who rarely carried the burden of proving it. But Gabriel had lived long enough to know that not all forward steps meant progress. Some were ceremonial, a gesture made to check a box, to nod politely toward the shifting tides without ever wading into the deeper waters. And here he was, floating in that uneasy space. That evening, he joined his wife at a dinner party hosted by one of her friends from the Arts Council. The house, tucked into the hills outside the city, was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that opened to a terrace overlooking the river. Gabriel had no particular interest in attending, but he came for Lillian. She understood these gatherings in a way he never could. How to navigate the delicate web of conversation and charm without revealing too much. Inside, the room hummed with the sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter. The crowd was mostly white, well-dressed, and spoke in the careful, measured tones of those accustomed to power. Gabriel moved through the space quietly, his presence acknowledged with polite nods but little engagement. He knew how this worked. Lillian, radiant in deep blue, drifted through the room with ease, exchanging pleasantries and knowing smiles. Gabriel, a voice called. He turned to see Alan Richards approaching, a man he had known for years. Though their relationship was confined to handshakes across boardroom tables, Alan was the kind of man whose wealth clung to him like a well-tailored suit. "Good to see you," Alan said, extending his hand. Gabriel shook it, feeling the strength of Alan's grip, the way some men used handshakes as tests. "Are you still with them at Sterling and Myers?" Alan asked. Gabriel smiled faintly. "I am." Alan nodded approvingly, but there was something else behind his gaze. A flicker of curiosity that Gabriel recognized all too well. "You've done well for yourself," Alan continued, his tone light but with an edge Gabriel couldn't quite place. "I imagine it wasn't easy. Breaking into that world." Gabriel's jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time he had heard such words, but their weight never diminished. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Gabriel replied. Alan chuckled, the kind of laugh that carried no real warmth. "I suppose not. But you know," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "it's good to see someone like you up there. The company could use more faces like yours at the table." There it was, the compliment wrapped in condescension. The invisible line drawn so delicately that it might have gone unnoticed by someone who hadn't spent their life navigating it. Gabriel's eyes met Alan's. "I'd like to think I'm there because I've earned it," he said quietly. Alan held his gaze for a moment, then smiled. Of course, that's not what I meant." But they both knew it was. Later that night, as Gabriel and Lillian drove home, the city lights blurred by the passing rain, Lillian reached across the console, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Alan's a fool," she said, reading his silence. Gabriel's grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly. "He doesn't know any better." "That's not an excuse," she replied softly. "No," Gabriel admitted, "but it's the truth." The car rolled to a stop at a red light, the rain tapping gently against the windshield. "I've known men like Alan my entire life," Gabriel said. "They believe the world was built for them, and they see the rest of us as visitors in their house." Lillian looked at him, her expression softening. "But we're not visitors, Gabe. You've built your own house. They're just not ready to admit they see it standing next to theirs." The light turned green, but Gabriel hesitated for a moment longer, his thoughts lingering. The world hadn't changed as much as they liked to believe, but he was still standing in it. It began the next morning. In the quiet of Gabriel Reed's office. The hum of the city filtered through the glass. Distant and indifferent, while the papers on his desk waited with a stillness that felt almost conspiratorial. He had arrived early, as he often did, savoring those rare hours before the office filled with the shuffle of colleagues and the guarded smiles that accompanied them. There was something about solitude that felt like armor. Something about silence that allowed him to breathe. But that silence rarely lasted. The first ripple came at 9:13 a.m. Gabriel was reviewing a financial report when his assistant, Rachel, knocked lightly and stepped inside. Her usual confidence was softened by hesitation. A subtle shift in her expression that Gabriel caught immediately. "There's been a change in the board meeting this afternoon," she said, carefully. Gabriel set his pen down. "A change?" Rachel nodded, glancing briefly at the papers in her hands. "Alan Richards requested to move up his presentation. It'll take place during the first hour. Which means your segment's been pushed back." Gabriel said nothing at first. It wasn't the shift in scheduling that caught his attention. Meetings shuffled all the time. It was the fact that Alan's segment was now positioned in front of Gabriel's. "Was this brought to the chair first?" Gabriel asked. Rachel shook her head. "Alan made the request directly." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, watching the way Rachel avoided his gaze. "Thank you, Rachel," he said quietly. She nodded and left the room. By the time the board gathered later that afternoon, Gabriel had already decided not to mention it. There was no need. The shift was subtle but familiar. The sort of maneuver he had seen before. Alan wasn't the type to confront Gabriel openly. No, Alan preferred adjustments that seemed harmless at first glance. A meeting rescheduled. A conversation redirected. Small, almost invisible things. But enough small things could make a man stumble. Alan's presentation stretched beyond its allotted time. He spoke about new market strategies with the ease of someone who knew the floor belonged to him, weaving in anecdotes and half-jokes that drew mild laughter from those seated around the long mahogany table. Gabriel listened, watching the way Alan commanded the room. When the chair finally called Gabriel's name, the energy in the room had shifted. Alan's voice still lingered, and Gabriel could feel the weight of it, as if he was stepping into a space already occupied by someone else's shadow. His presentation, crisp and deliberate, was met with polite nods. But Gabriel could sense the difference. It wasn't a dismissal. It was something quieter, a soft, collective agreement that Alan's words had already filled the room. By the time Gabriel finished, Alan was leaning back in his chair, nodding with that familiar, patronizing smile. "Well said," Alan remarked. "Though I imagine we'll circle back to a few of those points once we've reviewed everything more thoroughly." Gabriel smiled faintly, meeting Alan's gaze without flinching. "I'm sure we will," Gabriel replied, his voice calm. But beneath the surface, the air between them shifted. The kind of shift that most of the men around the table would never notice. Later, as Gabriel left the boardroom, one of the newer members, a man in his early 40s, caught up to him in the hallway. "Gabriel," the man said, lowering his voice, "I just wanted to say, I thought your presentation was excellent. Some of the points Alan made, well, I'm not sure they carried the same weight." Gabriel paused, searching the man's face. There was sincerity there, but also discomfort. The kind that came from witnessing something but not knowing how to name it. "I appreciate that," Gabriel said evenly. The man nodded, hesitated, then added, "I know what's happening in there. I wasn't sure if I should say anything." Gabriel's gaze softened, but his expression remained unreadable. "You just did," he replied. And with that, he continued down the hall, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble. That evening, Gabriel sat on his balcony. The city stretched out before him in flickering lights and quiet hums. Lillian joined him, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. She didn't ask about the meeting. Instead, she handed him a glass and leaned against the railing, watching the skyline with the kind of calm that Gabriel had always envied. For a while, neither of them spoke, but as the city's glow cast long shadows across their balcony, Gabriel finally broke the silence. "You ever notice how often the world doesn't need to say anything at all?" Lillian turned to him, her eyes sharp in the fading light. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room, she replied. Gabriel nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like the evening air. And as the city pulsed beneath them, he understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that the hardest battles were often fought without a single sound. It was the kind of Sunday morning that wrapped itself in stillness, soft sunlight filtering through linen curtains. The city outside stretching awake at its own pace. Gabriel Reed sat at the corner table of his favorite cafe. The kind of place where regulars were known by name but not always treated as equals. The newspaper lay open before him. But Gabriel wasn't reading. His eyes skimmed headlines without absorbing them. His mind tethered elsewhere. The morning hum of conversations drifted around him, a soft undercurrent of clinking cups. The low rustle of turning pages. And the occasional sharp note of laughter. He almost missed it at first. The sound of his name. Spoken quietly but with intention. Mr. Reed. Gabriel glanced up to find Alan Richards standing at the counter, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tailored coat. Alan hadn't come alone. 2 other men from the firm stood behind him, one of them already scanning the room for an empty table. Gabriel's gaze lingered for a brief moment before he nodded. Alan, he greeted. Alan's smile was quick, effortless. The kind of smile that implied familiarity but withheld sincerity. I didn't expect to see you here, Alan said, approaching Gabriel's table. Gabriel folded his newspaper carefully, setting it aside. I come here often. Alan's eyes flickered to the empty seat across from Gabriel, his head tilting just slightly in question. Mind if we join you? Gabriel hesitated. There was no polite way to refuse. Of course, Gabriel said, gesturing to the seat. Alan slipped into the chair opposite him, while the others settled at a nearby table. For a moment, the air between them held a strange tension, unspoken, but present. Gabriel could feel it even as Alan began speaking. His words laced with the kind of small talk that rarely concealed deeper motives. We missed you at the dinner last week, Alan remarked, stirring cream into his coffee with deliberate ease. The partners were asking about you. Gabriel's smile was faint, but steady. I had other obligations. Alan nodded, as if the answer had been expected. Of course. I imagine your schedule's demanding. There it was. The subtle shift. A casual comment, seemingly innocent, but loaded in the way only years of experience could detect. Gabriel met Alan's gaze directly. It is, he replied calmly. The conversation paused there, lingering in the shallow water of courtesies exchanged. But Gabriel had learned long ago that politeness was not always a bridge. It was often a barrier. One carefully placed to contain a person within the boundaries of what others considered acceptable. Alan's presence here wasn't an accident. Neither was the choice to sit at Gabriel's table. By the time they left the cafe, Alan's hand rested briefly on Gabriel's shoulder, a gesture meant to feel familiar. Though it was anything but. We'll see you at the next board review, Alan said. Try not to keep too much to yourself. Gabriel, we could use more of your insight, in certain areas. Gabriel's smile remained, but something colder had settled behind his eyes. I'll keep that in mind, he said, his tone even. As Alan and the others stepped out into the street, Gabriel watched them go, the distant hum of the city filling the space they left behind. Lillian's voice echoed softly in his mind. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. And as Gabriel sat there, his coffee untouched and cooling beside him, he realized that the weight of politeness was often the heaviest burden of all. Gabriel Reed had always known how to navigate silence. It was a skill learned not from books or classrooms, but from the soft insistence of necessity, a survival tool passed down like family heirlooms. The law firm's annual retreat was held at a private golf club just north of the city. The kind of place where history was written in the names engraved on plaques, but unwritten in the unspoken rules that governed who was invited in. Gabriel had been coming to these retreats for years, but he had never quite arrived. Even now, standing in the main hall, he could feel it. The weight of being seen but not fully acknowledged. Mr. Reed, a voice called behind him. He turned, already knowing who it would be. Alan Richards approached with the ease of a man comfortable in every room he entered. Gabriel, Alan greeted, his smile polished and practiced. You're early. Gabriel glanced around the half-filled room. Not by much. Alan nodded, his eyes scanning the space as if to confirm his own assessment of the crowd. You know how these things go, Alan said, lowering his voice slightly. They're more about appearances than anything else. Gabriel caught the edge of meaning hidden beneath those words. Appearances. The illusion of inclusion, held together by polite conversation and the occasional invitation that felt more like obligation. Alan's hand rested lightly on Gabriel's shoulder, guiding him toward the bar where other partners had gathered. We're glad you're here, Alan continued, his tone dropping into something just shy of conspiratorial. The firm's been making strides. But you know how people are. Sometimes they need a little encouragement. Gabriel's smile was tight. Encouragement. It was a word that often carried the weight of expectation. The silent plea to ease discomfort without disturbing the peace. He could feel it now, woven into the glances that followed him as Alan steered him into the fold. The bartender approached, and Gabriel ordered water. Alan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. As Gabriel sipped his drink, he listened. The conversation ebbed and flowed around him, carefully circling safe topics, client acquisitions, quarterly reports, and the upcoming charity gala. It wasn't until the topic shifted to recruitment that Gabriel felt the undercurrent shift. You know, Alan began, stirring his drink absently. We're reviewing the summer associates this week. Promising group this year. Gabriel nodded but said nothing. Alan's gaze flicked toward him. A silent nudge. Your mentee, Alan continued. What's his name? DeMarcus. Bright kid. But there are concerns. Gabriel set his glass down slowly, his movements deliberate. Concerns? Alan exhaled lightly, as if he disliked having to explain. Not about his performance, Alan clarified, though the pause afterward lingered a beat too long. It's more about fit. You understand. Gabriel's grip tightened around the rim of his glass. Fit. The word dropped between them like a stone, rippling outward. I understand, Gabriel said, his voice even. Alan smiled, relieved to have sidestepped potential discomfort. But Gabriel wasn't finished. I understand that DeMarcus outperformed nearly every associate in his class. Gabriel continued, his tone steady but pointed. I understand that he secured the highest profile case last quarter. And I understand that fit has always been a convenient way to explain away things that make people uncomfortable. Alan's smile flickered but didn't falter. You've always had a way with words, Alan replied smoothly, lifting his drink in silent acknowledgement. Gabriel returned the gesture, but his eyes never left Alan's. Later that evening, Gabriel stood alone on the balcony, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The laughter and clinking glasses from inside felt distant, muffled by the heavy glass doors that separated him from the others. Lillian's voice echoed in his memory, soft but firm. They only let you in to show they can. But they'll never let you forget it. He hadn't forgotten. And neither, he suspected, had Alan. Gabriel's phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from DeMarcus. They said I didn't fit the culture. Thanks for everything, Mr. Reed. I'll be fine. Gabriel closed his eyes, the familiar weight settling back into place. Some lessons were taught in whispers, in the spaces between the lines. But tonight, Gabriel Reed found himself wondering how much longer he was willing to let silence speak for him. Gabriel Reed sat at the far end of the conference table, pen poised but unmoving above the crisp white page. The meeting had stretched into its second hour, and the air in the room felt heavier with each passing minute. The partners spoke in measured tones, their words carefully selected, like men tiptoeing across thin ice, afraid to admit how cold the water beneath them really was. On the agenda, diversity initiatives. Gabriel might have laughed if it weren't so painfully familiar. Alan Richards sat 2 seats to his left, leading the discussion with the same easy confidence he wore like a second skin. This year, Alan began, glancing at the neatly printed report in front of him. We've increased minority hires by nearly 12%. A promising development. Promising. Gabriel's gaze drifted toward the window, watching the slow crawl of city traffic below. We've also implemented bias training for mid-level managers. Alan continued, early feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. Gabriel's pen finally met the paper, tracing idle circles in the margin of his notepad. Bias training. He'd sat through enough of them to know the routine. A smiling consultant, hired at a handsome rate, leading exercises designed to make white men squirm just enough to feel enlightened, but never uncomfortable enough to question why men like Gabriel were still the only ones at this table who weren't white. When Alan glanced his way, Gabriel could already sense the expectation in the air. A nod, a polite smile, a gentle affirmation that the firm was on the right track. Gabriel said nothing. He didn't need to. Alan's smile faltered, but only for a second. We're also proud to announce the firm will sponsor the Black Law Association's summer gala, Alan added, clearly eager to move on. Gabriel, I believe you've agreed to attend? The words were honeyed, smooth with the sweetness of inclusion. But Gabriel felt the bitterness underneath. They wanted him to be seen visible enough to confirm their progress but silent enough not to disrupt the fragile balance they called peace. Yes, Gabriel replied finally, his voice calm but cool. I'll attend. Alan beamed. Fantastic. The gala was held at a grand hall downtown. Chandeliers glinting above rows of black and gold tables. The room pulsed with conversation. A celebration of black excellence and achievement. Gabriel moved through the crowd, exchanging handshakes and polite greetings. But his mind lingered on the meeting. Near the bar, DeMarcus appeared at his side. The younger man's smile easy but his eyes sharp. Heard about the diversity initiative? DeMarcus said casually, sipping his drink. They must be proud. Gabriel glanced sideways, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. They are. DeMarcus chuckled under his breath. You ever wonder why we're always the ones being celebrated, but never the ones making the decisions? DeMarcus asked, his tone light but edged with something heavier. Gabriel's gaze swept across the room. The answer hung between them. Unspoken, always present. Politeness. Gabriel said finally. It's a quieter kind of violence. DeMarcus raised an eyebrow, but Gabriel didn't elaborate. Some things didn't need to be explained. Later that evening, Gabriel found himself standing on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the dark. The voices from inside spilled out behind him, but he let them fade, the weight of the evening settling into his bones. He thought of his father, a man who had spent his life keeping his head down and his voice soft, hoping it would shield him from the world's sharper edges. It hadn't, and Gabriel had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of prison. The door behind him creaked open, and Alan stepped out, loosening his tie as he joined Gabriel at the railing. Quite the turnout, Alan said, his gaze following Gabriel's across the city. Gabriel nodded. It is. Alan took a long breath, his posture relaxing. You know, Alan began, his voice dipping into the same careful tone he'd used at the meeting. I've been meaning to tell you how much we appreciate the work you've done. Really, Gabriel, the younger associates, DeMarcus, especially, they look up to you. Gabriel didn't reply. Alan hesitated, clearly expecting something more. When Gabriel remained silent, Alan cleared his throat. There's room for growth at the firm. Alan continued, his voice softening in a way that made Gabriel's skin prickle. If you keep doing what you're doing, I have no doubt you'll go far. Gabriel's pen tapped lightly against the edge of the balcony. I appreciate that, Gabriel said, his tone neutral. Alan smiled, clearly satisfied. Gabriel watched him retreat back inside, the weight of his absence pressing down harder than his presence ever had. He turned back toward the city, letting the cool air settle around him. Growth. It was a word Alan tossed around easily. But Gabriel knew better. Growth wasn't about moving forward. It was about standing still long enough to feel the roots beneath you. The ones tangled in the cracks of the foundation, in the spaces between polite words and measured smiles. And Gabriel Reed had spent his whole life learning how to grow in the quiet. Gabriel Reed had always believed there were two ways men fought battles. Some fought with fire, loud, untamed, and impossible to ignore. They took to the streets, their voices cutting through the silence, demanding to be heard. Others fought in shadows, quiet, deliberate, carving out space with steady hands and patient hearts. Gabriel had long told himself he belonged to the latter. But tonight, As he sat alone in the corner of the boardroom, he felt something stirring beneath his skin. A different kind of fire. The day had started like any other. Coffee in hand, Gabriel had arrived early, hoping to steal a few moments of stillness before the partners flooded in. But stillness rarely lasted in places like this. Gabriel. Alan's voice broke the silence. Smooth as polished glass. Gabriel glanced up, watching Alan cross the room. His footsteps unhurried. There's been some discussion regarding the hiring process. Alan began, lowering himself into the chair across from Gabriel. I wanted to get ahead of it. Gabriel set his coffee down carefully, already sensing where the conversation was heading. I understand DeMarcus applied for the senior associate position. Alan continued, folding his hands neatly on the table. A bright young man. Talented. Gabriel said nothing. Alan leaned forward slightly. But, he added, his voice dipping just enough to reveal the hesitation beneath it. Some of the partners feel he might need a few more years. A little more polish. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Gabriel felt his jaw tighten. Polish. He'd heard that word before, whispered in corners, stitched between polite rejections and careful explanations. Too soon. Not quite ready. More time to grow. I assume those concerns weren't raised when Mark applied for the same position last year. Gabriel said, keeping his voice even. Alan's smile didn't falter, but Gabriel noticed the flicker in his eyes. Mark had more client-facing experience. Alan replied smoothly. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. Mark oversaw 2 cases. DeMarcus led 4. Alan shifted in his seat. But the smile remained. Gabriel, I think you understand how these decisions work. Gabriel's gaze never wavered. I do, he said quietly. And that was the problem. By lunchtime, the weight of the morning's conversation lingered in Gabriel's chest. An ache he couldn't shake. He stepped outside, letting the city's hum wash over him. But the noise did little to drown out the thoughts circling his mind. Across the street, DeMarcus sat at a cafe table, laughing with a colleague. The younger man's smile was easy. His shoulders relaxed, still untouched by the slow erosion Gabriel had come to know so well. Gabriel considered crossing the street, telling DeMarcus what he'd heard. But he didn't. Not yet. Because part of him knew how the conversation would end. Be patient, DeMarcus. Keep working. Your time will come. Gabriel had heard those words at DeMarcus's age. And at the time, he'd believed them. But now, watching DeMarcus from across the street, Gabriel wondered if patience had ever been the right answer. That evening, as the partners gathered for the final vote on promotions, the tension in the room felt thicker than usual. Gabriel sat near the window, his gaze fixed on the city lights beyond the glass, the glow painting faint gold streaks across the table. Alan called the meeting to order, his voice steady, familiar. One by one, the partners cast their votes, their decisions punctuated by polite murmurs and brief nods. And then it was Gabriel's turn. He felt the weight of the room shift toward him, eyes expectant. Mr. Reed? Alan prompted, his smile carefully measured. Gabriel's pen hovered over the page. For a moment, he considered the simplest option. The quiet nod, the unchallenged approval. But the fire beneath his skin burned hotter now. And this time, he let it rise. I vote no, Gabriel said, his voice calm but resolute. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Subtle but undeniable. Alan's expression didn't change, but Gabriel saw the tension in his shoulders, the tightening around his mouth. May I ask why? Alan's tone remained polite, but the edge was unmistakable. Gabriel met his gaze without hesitation. Because DeMarcus is ready, he said simply. Silence settled over the table. Alan's pen tapped lightly against his notepad, the sound loud in the stillness. I appreciate your perspective, Alan replied, his voice soft but sharp enough to draw blood. But I think we should consider the broader picture. Gabriel leaned forward slightly. I am, he said. Alan blinked, clearly unprepared for the response. Gabriel let the silence stretch, allowing each partner to sit with the weight of his words. When Alan finally moved to the next item on the agenda, Gabriel saw it. The flicker of uncertainty in the room. A small crack in the foundation. But cracks, Gabriel knew, had a way of growing. Later that night, as Gabriel left the office, DeMarcus's voice called out behind him. Mr. Reed. Gabriel turned, watching DeMarcus jog to catch up. I heard about the vote, DeMarcus said, his eyes bright with quiet disbelief. I don't know how to thank you. Gabriel smiled faintly. Don't, he replied. Just make sure when you're sitting at that table, you remember what it felt like to stand outside it. DeMarcus nodded, understanding without words. As Gabriel walked toward his car, the fire within him didn't fade. It burned steady now, slow, deliberate, a different kind of fire. One he had no intention of putting out. The night air was thick, the kind of humidity that seemed to settle not just on the skin but deep in the bones. Gabriel Reed walked the length of the empty street, his footsteps soft against the concrete. The city felt different at this hour, quieter, stripped of its pretense. Above him, the glow of streetlights flickered, casting long shadows against the closed storefronts. But Gabriel wasn't looking at the lights. He was watching his own reflection in the glass of the barbershop window. For a long time, he stood there, his face half obscured by the darkened glass. Somewhere behind him, he heard the distant hum of traffic, the sound of a city still moving forward even as the weight of its history dragged behind it. And for the first time in a long while, Gabriel felt like he was standing still. It had been 2 weeks since the vote. DeMarcus's name now hung outside the corner office, gold lettering against dark oak. Polished so smooth Gabriel could see his own reflection in it. But the victory, if that's what it was, felt smaller than Gabriel had expected. The partners had relented, but not without resistance. Their smiles had been tight, their congratulations clipped. We're proud to support DeMarcus, Alan had said afterward, shaking Gabriel's hand with a grip that lingered just a second too long. But you know how these things are. Change can't happen overnight. Gabriel had nodded, but something in Ellen's tone had clung to him, like the faint aftertaste of bitterness that refused to wash away. Not overnight, Gabriel thought, staring at his reflection. No, but it should have happened years ago. The next morning, Gabriel found himself back in the office, sipping black coffee as the city woke around him. Across the hall, DeMarcus's office door stood open, his laughter spilling into the hallway, bright, unguarded. Gabriel listened quietly, the sound both warming and exhausting. It reminded him of who he'd once been, and of the weight that laughter carried. By noon, Gabriel's desk was covered in files, the hours bleeding together in quiet monotony. But as he glanced at the clock, a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. DeMarcus stood in the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets. Got a minute? Gabriel nodded, motioning to the chair across from him. DeMarcus hesitated briefly, his usual confidence dimmed by something unspoken. I just wanted to say thank you. DeMarcus began, his voice softer than usual. I know you didn't have to. Gabriel held up a hand. You earned it, he said simply. I just made sure they saw it. DeMarcus smiled faintly, but there was something else in his eyes, something Gabriel recognized well. They're not making it easy, are they? Gabriel asked. DeMarcus exhaled, leaning forward. Not exactly. The meetings feel different now. Like they're waiting for me to prove I belong there, every time I speak. Gabriel nodded slowly. They are. DeMarcus blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. You'll get used to it, Gabriel added, but don't mistake getting used to it for accepting it. The room fell quiet. DeMarcus studied Gabriel for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. I guess I thought it'd feel different once I got here, DeMarcus admitted. Gabriel's eyes drifted to the window. The skyline stretched out before them. It never does, Gabriel said quietly, but that's not why we keep climbing. DeMarcus frowned slightly, his gaze distant. Then why do we? Gabriel's grip tightened around his coffee cup. Because someone's always watching, Gabriel replied, his tone heavier now, even if we can't see them. That evening, as Gabriel left the office, he lingered outside DeMarcus's door. The gold lettering caught the last of the setting sun, gleaming faintly against the dark wood. Gabriel stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of the years behind him. The quiet battles, the silent victories, and the scars that no one else could see. It wasn't about the office. Gabriel realized. It never had been. The real battle wasn't fought in boardrooms or corner offices. It was fought in the silence that followed. In the spaces where men like Gabriel stood alone, waiting for the world to catch up. And as Gabriel stepped into the cool night air, he carried that silence with him, knowing full well that some battles didn't end with applause. Some ended with nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of having refused to sit still. And maybe, Gabriel thought, that was enough.